in Arkansas, and I think it was Florida. And I think their acronym SAC is very appropriate.
David, take control.
Well, I'm looking around to see who we're missing right now. So I know Bruce is going to be tied up till about 2:30. Jane till a little after 2:30, and Barbara's out today. And I was just looking for David Ryan. Mary Heath's with us now. Terrific. And who are we? Are we missing John?
Yes. No, he's here.
John Morgan.
Yep. I'll text.
All right, great. Thanks. And I think I see everybody else. So great. So I think we can probably get things started. It's 2 minutes after 2, and I'm pleased to call to order the meeting of the Commission to study school funding. Today's August 24th, 2020, and welcome everybody back. I know we're not getting there's no summer break, but there's no summer break for anybody this year. So it's 2020. What do we expect? So we'll get things started with a roll call of attendance per the governor's emergency order, and I'll start it off. Dave Luno reporting from Hopkinton with Ozzie, the long-haired dachshund. And next up, we've got Mel Myler.
Mel Myler from calling in from Kentucky, and my wife is in the room.
Okay. And Dick Ames.
Yeah, I'm here in Jaffrey, alone in my house.
Okay, and Rick Ladd.
Rick Ladd's here, present in Haverhill, New Hampshire. Welcome back, Mel. From Maine to New Hampshire.
So, and Jay Kahn.
Present in Stoddard. Should be alone all afternoon.
Okay, and hopefully we'll catch up with Senator Morgan shortly, but we got Bill Ardinger with us.
Yes, sir. In Concord, New Hampshire by myself.
Great, thanks, Bill. And let's see, I think Jane's going to be joining us a little bit later. Corinne Cascadden.
I am here in Berlin, New Hampshire, joining you pet owners with a Siberian Husky and a Wackadoodle.
Okay.
A Labradoodle.
Labradoodle. Thanks, Corinne. Let's see. Dave Ryan in yet? I don't see him. John Beardmore.
Good afternoon. Calling in from my home in Hopkinton. Nobody else is here.
Great. Thanks, John. And Iris Estabrook. Oh, Iris, your audio is not working. I know you're.
Oh.
Oh,
there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, yep.
Okay. At home in Barrington, families around and about.
Terrific. Thanks, Iris. And let's see, Barbara's out today. And Chris Dwyer.
Chris Dwyer, home in Portsmouth, alone.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And Susan Heward.
Susan Heward in my office in Concord.
Great. Thanks, Susan. And Val Zanchuk.
Val Zanchuk's alone in his office in Jaffrey.
Okay. And Mary Heath.
Mary Heath here in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I'm home alone.
Okay, and let's see, we've got some folks from our car seat team, starting with Jordan Hensley.
Jordan Hensley here in Dover. My fiance is in the other room.
Okay, and Carrie Portree.
Hi, Carrie Portree. I'm in Dover. My husband's in the other room.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. And I think Bruce is going to join us later, right? Okay.
About 15 minutes.
Let's see. And let's see. We've got Jen Four from Committee Research.
Hi, Jen Four calling in from Concord, home alone.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And we've got some of our AAR team with us, including Drew Atchison.
Hi, Drew Atchison in Washington, D.C., here with some other family in the house.
Great, thanks, Drew. And Bruce Baker?
Bruce Baker here in Gladstone, New Jersey, adjacent to Bedminster, which is apparently well known now. And I'm here. My son and wife are in the house, but at the other end.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruce. And Jesse Levin?
Hi, this is Jesse Levin. I'm calling in from Pacifica, California, and my two boys are upstairs engaged in distance learning with their mother.
Okay, thanks, Jesse. So it's all started. All right, did I miss anybody? I don't think so. So great. Jordan, how are we looking on access?
Doing pretty good. I have got a note that some folks who are currently in the meeting did have some trouble logging in. It sounds like Zoom is having some regional glitches. I have not gotten any contact either via phone or email saying that anyone hasn't been able to access, but I know that, you know, there were some issues around today, so I'll keep an eye on that throughout the meeting.
Great. Yeah, I actually saw a report on that late this morning that Zoom was experiencing, I think, some worldwide outages. So if hopefully we can get through this over the next 2 hours without, we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. And Jordan, if anything comes up with respect to access, please interrupt, jump in, let us know, because that's obviously a key element to these public meetings. So, all right, great, thanks. Before we get started, I want to just take a couple minutes to talk about some things, because clearly we're I think in the commission work, while we're still developing findings, we're getting into some really sort of hot topics now, which I've been looking forward to talking about for a long time. So, and I think all of us have been. And in particular, we've got this is really part 2 of AIR's initial findings, draft findings being reported to us, and obviously these things are going to continue to be worked on over time too. So we're not holding anything back as a commission, but a couple things have really I don't know made an imprint when I'm looking at the work from AIR, and the first one was presented to us 2 weeks ago on August 10th, and in the conclusion of the report, they had the very first item, and I'm reading it, is New Hampshire school funding system is inequitable from both student and taxpayer perspectives. I think that's something that that a lot of us may have felt for a long time. Certainly, a lot of our constituents and neighbors may have felt that, but to see it in writing, I think brought a new level of meaning and recognition to that as a finding, and that's something that really, when you take a look at what AIR showed to us 2 weeks ago, and I think what was presented to the fiscal policy group last week, recognizes that key finding. Something else that I think we're going to be seeing today, we saw it last week in fiscal policy, but AIR is providing the commission with a straw man example of for funding schools using current sources of revenue, and how they could look under a variety of different funding options. So there's certainly more than 2 ways to look at how to fund schools, and the commission will be getting into those this fall. I don't see either of the AIR examples as taking a position on revenue sources, and to be frank, the commission's not at a point where revenue sources are really under consideration. We're still sort of learning about what the impact would be and what different scenarios would look like. So it's really important that the commission be able to examine that. And looking at the examples from AIR, it really shows the commission that there are in fact ways where school funding can be something that's more equitable for both students and taxpayers. And I guess my final comment would be while I think I know the work that this commission's doing is important, and in particularly the final report that it delivers to the general court in December, that it's really up to the legislature and the governor to determine how the state goes about funding its public schools. And I really do hope and feel strongly that the work that we do as a commission is going to be a really valuable resource to all policymakers of all parties, governor's office, House and Senate, when writing the budget and developing legislation. So with that said, well, anybody want to add on to that?
Yeah.
Rick, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. One of the things that we have not yet really had a good discussion on, I noticed in an email that came forward to us from the general public, from Jordan this morning, the sentence here is what's intriguing to me. Could different tax rates for different property classifications also help improve the equity of taxation? So we have seen in our mandate properties A, B, C are, I don't think we've had a real good discussion on that yet. And I know, Dave, you got a lot on your plate, but somewhere can we mix this in to where, so we have a better understanding what is meant by ABC?
Sure. Absolutely, what is meant by ABC. But I think getting to your point and the comment that you were reading from, we actually discussed it a bit at the last fiscal policy work group meeting when looking, what are the possible, is it legal to have different rates for different classifications? And in fact, yeah, the Department of Revenue representatives from the DRA reported yes, but also how that would complicate everything from tax bills to I don't know, reconciliation that the DRA does. There's a pretty significant structural impact on that. And John, am I being consistent with what we heard last week?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, that I wasn't being consistent?
No, not inconsistent.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
We already tax a utility property different than we do all other property for the purpose of the statewide property tax.
Right.
We've definitely kicked around the idea of like a homestead exemption, that type of thing. But I don't think we've made a determination on how to examine that policy alternative.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you're right, Rick. We haven't had an extensive discussion on it. But,
yeah, we've had the discussion, and I agree. We had it the last time we met. But I think John's right, too. We haven't gone forward and made any decisions.
Right.
Dave,
Mel,
Dave, I just want to underscore what you were saying, and that is, we're at this critical period of time right now where we're getting this information, we're getting some opportunities and some scenarios from AIR, and it's very quick for those who haven't been involved in this to jump to conclusions that this commission hasn't made yet.
Yeah.
And I think our role as a commission is to look at all of the options, then come up with some recommendations, but we're not there yet to come to some recommendation, a specific recommendation. And I think the other thing that we need to realize is that with the data that we have with the rich data that we have gathered so far, we are really laying a foundation for not only this commission and the next legislative session, but even legislative sessions beyond that. And so I think it's important for us as commission members to recognize and keep an open mind to look at what are the possibilities out there. And that's, we're right now looking at the possibilities. And I think it's going to be very easy for some folks who have a bias about what the reason why this was even formed, to come to quick conclusions, put a letter in the editor, make an op-ed piece without really having the full breadth of understanding of what we're trying to do here. So I just want to underscore what you're saying, is that we need to keep an open mind. We've got time to come to these conclusions. The work groups are working together to try to narrow these down for the rest of the commission. And we just need to keep on keeping on what we've been doing, so that we can see what the possibilities are. There are a lot of people out there that have got a lot of different ideas on what the solution is right now, without the breadth of the information that we've been gathering from AIR, et cetera. And don't forget, this is the first time since Augenblick that we've been able to use an outside firm to provide us an inside look at ourselves through their lens. So I just think we need to continue to do what we're doing, and we're going to come to that point in time where we will be making some decisions, but we're not quite there yet.
No, thanks very much, Mel. Anybody else want to add? Jay, you want to jump in with a few words?
I think you've set the context. I think we're all worried about conclusions being written before the report is ready, and that's, I think, the summary of your message. And I recognize there's a lot of ground to be covered. If we look at the 2002 and 2008 reports, they go through an abundance of detail of all options, just to educate readers of the world of possibilities that were looked at. We've got a great opportunity to benchmark these things too, because AIR is our guide at our side, and that too is new for us. Not just to benchmark against our own performance, but to benchmark against the performance of 49 other states. So I just want to thank AIR, because their work is now a product for our use, and we can use that product to lay out multiple scenarios. And I think we all respect that those are steps that we need to take.
Great, thanks.
Multiple scenarios.
Thank you very much, Jay. And design thinking isn't easy, and so I'm grateful to everybody that's been involved for their continued effort on this. And anyway,
Dave, John Beardmore, I see with hand raised.
Oh, sorry about that, John. Yeah.
Sure, just didn't know if this was my spot to just raise a concern I had. Unclear to me whether this line of conversation is in relation in part to some feedback that I've provided the chair and the vice chair of the commission in regards to what I perceive to be a sort of multi-pronged embrace of pursuing further research into an income and a sales tax in a way that I've found to be untethered to the work we've done so far. And I've raised that now privately with Dave, and I raised it publicly in the fiscal policy group a couple weeks back, and feel that I've been at times admonished for not having an open mind and not following our group agreements. But understanding where we are in the process, it just seemed very strange to me to, out of the blue, my perception anyway, start talking about income tax issues in the fiscal policy group and two, also where we hadn't otherwise really engaged in a broader inventory of what other revenue alternatives we need, or even if we need other revenue alternatives, because the commission hasn't conclusively come to a point where we've determined that one adequacy formula is better than the next, and the one we favor requires more revenue. And that sort of, observation was bolstered when I saw an income and a sales tax identified rather prominently in a proposed poll question that was shared with the group by Carrie late last week. So it just, on the one hand, I certainly understand the need to be, open-minded and to cast a wide net, and that, our research will hopefully be useful for many years to come, but also really lack for an understanding as to why we're spending time and money pursuing certain revenue alternatives when we've not made a determination that we actually need revenue. So.
No, fair comments, John, and thanks for that. I think, I know exactly what you're referring to when I think I think it was a couple of weeks ago when I sort of did remind everybody, and it wasn't an admonishment to anybody in particular, but reminding people of our group agreements and being open-minded, and I think everybody really has done a remarkable job at doing that. So there's nothing, I don't mean anything negative on anybody on that front, but I think we all recognize that there's a lot of work that we've accomplished so far. There's still a lot of work ahead of us. We had a short period of time, even back when this commission was first proposed, in a budget that was vetoed for totally other reasons, and rather than being able to get started in last September, it was January, and then we missed most of April, missed all of April, and so a compressed work path got even further compressed, and we broke down into three work groups that are proceeding in parallel, and in some cases the work groups efforts are going to have to be done without knowing what final commission recommendations might be in terms of expenditures, revenue needed. And I think, even when you look back at some of the things we discussed, and I couldn't point to the specific meeting, but when we discussed the Shaheen 2000 revenue report, we were looking at a variety of different sources there and the characteristics behind each one of those. And so, sort of completing that revenue potential review, I think, is something that follows the design thinking process that we've employed here. And you're right. I mean, it may be that oh, well, we really didn't even need to look at that one because the commission's decided to go a different way with expenditures or total revenue needs or something like that. But at least we're ready to be responsive to that, as all of our adequacy, distribution work, fiscal policy work, and public engagement work come to a conclusion together as we frame up and build our final report due in December. So it's not the most efficient process, but hopefully it's a good process that works, and it's something that hasn't been done here in New Hampshire for a long time. So anyway, we're a few minutes behind, but Bruce has joined us now, and he wouldn't, he'd say, hey, what went wrong if we weren't a few minutes behind, right? So before, I do want to get started into our agenda. I do want to flip the order of our two major points and bring up public engagement first. If for no other reason than John Beardmore actually brought it up, and so other people may also have that concern, and so I'd like to sort of hand it over to Mel and Bruce and Carrie to review the public engagement plans. Obviously, this is a major part of the design thinking approach, and so Mel, can I turn it over to you?
Thank you, Dave. I'm going to ask Carrie to put up a graphic that has been kind of our guidepost here. So Carrie, if you could pull that up, I'd appreciate it.
For our record, David, I'd point out John Morgan's now present with us.
Oh, fantastic. Welcome, John. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay.
So for the group, you can see we've already begun some engagement with, as you can see by the dates, the March, June, July dates. And I don't need to read the graph for you. You can read that for yourself. But what we're trying to do is to engage as many different types of people as we possibly can. We are moving into the fall activity, and we are going to be conducting the Granite State poll. John made reference to the one item on the survey dealing with forms of revenue. That has been a historic question that has been asked by the Granite State Service Center, and we'll be able to get some longitudinal look at where people were in previous polling to this particular poll. We are in the process now of beginning to have another meetings with the stakeholder groups, those municipal and school leaders in the fall, as well as beginning to develop student voice and getting public comments from kids who are currently seniors or who just graduated from high school to get their input. And you need to know that there is a brief orientation of what school funding is all about prior to conducting those particular programs. The other thing that we're also doing too is we're actively now beginning to identify groups of 65 and older residents to get their input, as well as taxpayers associations. We feel it's important that we touch base with those who are engaged in taxpayers associations for their input to some of the work that we have been doing. The other piece that we've expanded to since we last saw this graphic as a group was to begin to, after the November election, is to begin to have a program for elected officials to share what we've kind of learned throughout this process and look for some opportunities to have an open dialogue with those who are going to be in the legislative session next time, so they kind of know the history of what we've been doing. And again, by late November, we will obviously have some of our recommendations formatted so that we can begin to talk with them about some of the things that we have found. So, you know, we've got a very active program, and this is a vital, as far as we're concerned, a vital part of this program to continue to get feedback from people on exactly what we're doing. The survey that was conducted by the educators, those almost 1,800 responses, that is currently being confirmed and being finalized for a report back to the commission in a very soon fashion. And so that's kind of where we are at this point in time, David. Carrie, do you have any comments or any other additions to that? By the way, you should know that it is now Dr. Carrie we should be referring to her, not just Ms. Carrie. Congratulations, Carrie.
No, I think that covered it nicely, Mel.
Great. Thanks, Mel and Carrie. Bruce, did you want to add anything?
That was pretty thorough. I just want to emphasize that we'll continue every other Wednesday afternoon public comment periods that we began in July and August. We'll be going to every 2 weeks, starting, as it says here, on September 16th. It just says the September dates up, but we'll continue those right into October and November to be sure that there's a time when any member of the public who wishes to can provide oral testimony as at least the leadership of the commission is available on those days. All of that, again, is recorded and included in our consideration of possible options as we move towards the final report.
I mean, and the other thing I think is important to note too is that all the work we've been doing is all recorded. I mean, whether it be visually, whether the notes of the meeting. I know you've all have looked at the notes of the meeting. The notes of the work group meetings are very, very detailed. So the issue of transparency, of trying to make sure that anyone who has an interest in school funding, there is a total record of this. And I don't think that's ever been done before in the totality of what we've been trying to do here.
Great. Thanks. Mel, yeah.
Just to build on what Bruce said about public commenting sessions, and we have specific student voice focused public commenting periods on September 23rd and October 7th. So those will be specific for, again, students that want to bring their thinking about school funding to the commission. And again, those are hour-long periods. I just wanted to point out that that part of student voice as well. Great.
Thanks very much, Carrie. So there's obviously there's a lot going on in public engagement and public outreach, and I none of us planned that we were going to be going through a pandemic while we were doing this, but I think the public engagement approach had been designed pre-pandemic, and I'm really so grateful that that it's in place and it's as significant as it is, because it's just harder than ever right now to get mind share from people who are concerned about return to school, concerned about the health of their families, concerned about how to make ends meet, concerned about their jobs, things that maybe a lot of people weren't concerned about prior to middle March, and so so it does make our job harder, and really glad that we have such an extensive public engagement effort in this. Bruce.
Dave, quick comment on that. If we were to look back at the original scope of work between the Carsey School and the Commission, we'd see that the public engagement effort, as Carrie just displayed it, is probably 4 or 5 times greater than the level of effort we had anticipated last January when we developed that agreement. That's because of the importance, clearly, of hearing from as many folks as we can about a really complex issue. What's allowed us to do that partly is that, if you'll recall, we appropriated funds to support public members of this commission to travel to and from our meetings. Well, that hasn't happened. So we're reallocating some of those dollars to support the kind of robust public engagement that Carrie described. We're doing some other things internally that we'll catch up the commission on, but I did want to emphasize that we did not anticipate early on how broad and necessary this kind of engagement effort would be. I'm proud of Carsey's ability to be responsive to the importance of hearing from so many different groups.
Great. Bruce, thanks for pointing that out. Anything else to add while we're on public engagement? Any questions? Rick.
Yeah, sorry to ask all the questions here, but for Mel and the folks there in the engagement subcommittee, has there been any effort to think about, we usually have in the House, 25% of our reps decide not to run or retire. Are we going to reach out to these people that maybe have worked in the House for years and may have some significant issues?
Good question, Rick, and good suggestion. That has not been part of our conversation, but clearly, as we begin to deal with the legislative leaders, et cetera, that can be put into the process too. Thanks for that suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
You're welcome.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please, Carrie.
Is there so we are doing, I guess when you say retired, Rick, I'm not sure if that would include like a 65 plus group. But if it does, people retire at many ages.
That's most of us.
So that could be, if there's like a way to have a list generated of those folks, I think that would be a good list of people to include in those two focus groups. So if you want to forward along some ideas about how to contact that group, I think we want to be cognizant of how many more things we add, but I think that might be a way to kind of fold the group you just talked about in. So feel free to email Mel and I about.
I think last session, Rick, what was the average age of a representative? Was like 67, something like that.
That's right.
And there are some of us who are above that age, so it's.
Yeah. But some of those which are, I mean, they're retiring, they've already retired from their job, but they're retiring from maybe 10 years in the House.
Yeah.
And with that, they've gone through some of these changes. Maybe they have some wonderful ideas for us as well.
Good suggestion. Yeah. Thank you, Rick. Yeah.
No, it's really good. So great. Anything else for public engagement? Super. So we're just a little behind schedule, but we made up a little bit of time. Bruce, at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to you to march us through part 2 of the AIR findings.
Well, I'll delegate that march to our colleagues at AIR with Drew Atchison as in the past. We'll have two report on 2 areas of focus this afternoon. One is after hearing 2 weeks ago from AIR to the full commission about ways to understand the expense side of an adequate education and the variations in expenditures, per pupil expenditures across school districts, and how that relates to variables like local property wealth and student characteristics and student needs. What we'll see today is a discussion of, and of course the fiscal policy work group and some others have seen this in their work group meetings, a discussion of ways to sticking with the property tax as the primary revenue source for funding our public schools, the ways to mix the ratio of what we refer to as the local property tax and a statewide property tax. Even though it's always the local property that's being taxed, the allocation of those taxes to both municipalities and the state government and then back to school districts is currently a part of our process. And as we've tried to figure out ways to create more equity in terms of tax impact on local communities while attending to the outcomes of our public education system, AIR has looked at national examples from other states and used New Hampshire data to model a couple of different options for again what that range of what the ratios are in terms of how much local property tax versus a statewide property tax with or without some minimum local contribution would contribute to the current level of expenses for public schools. So long-winded introduction to that piece. And then Drew will introduce the commission to a tool that AIR has developed that allows commission members as well as anybody, the general public, to use a spreadsheet in which they can test the variations in local property values, per pupil expenditures, other variables, just to run what if scenarios so that all of us can have kind of an open experience with thinking about what the possibilities are for, again, revenue mix and expenditure mix in our schools. So Drew, I probably mashed that introduction up pretty badly. You'll fix it for me and I'll turn it over to you. And we'll go until for an hour or so on this.
All right. Says I'm still not able to share.
Let's see.
All right. Jordan gave me the thumbs up. Here we go. All right. So this is a very similar presentation to one I gave to the fiscal policy work group last week. I've done a few slight updates to a few of the slides to keep current with the most up-to-date version of the simulator. So as Bruce mentioned, I'll walk through these slides that present two options. And again, these are just options and examples, but aren't meant to be the full range of possibilities. And then I'll get into the simulator and show you how that works after these slides. These slides are relatively quick, only 5 slides, so hopefully we can get through these and get to the simulator. But as Bruce mentioned, these two options rely heavily on a statewide property tax, where all revenue raised from the property tax can be distributed according to the funding formula. So this is a deviation from how things currently work in New Hampshire, where the statewide property tax is retained locally, even if jurisdictions raise more than what is currently meant to go toward the adequacy aid formula. So here it's being taken in by the state, and the full amount can be redistributed according to the funding formula. So the two options that I'm going to present are to establish a minimum local contribution based on a uniform minimum local education tax rate. And in this option, the minimum local contribution goes toward the funding of the formula, and the remainder in funds, and it goes through state revenues. And then the second option is that there's no expected local contribution and the entire formula is funded through state revenue sources. So let's go through these examples. So this is kind of an excerpt from the simulator. So when you look at the simulator, this little chart at the bottom, this little table at the bottom is something that you'll see in the simulator. But this is setting a minimum local contribution of $5 per 1,000 as of assessed value. And that $5 per 1,000, if it is applied statewide, raises $937 million in local property taxes, and thus reducing the state's obligation to fund the formula. So the state's obligation would be approximately $2 million after you deduct that $937 million. And I've done an assumption where about $602 million is from non-swept state revenue sources. I know some members of the commission have pointed out that that's probably a little low. It's probably more like $650 million, but I'll show you how you can update that in the simulator when we get there. Assuming the remaining revenue is 1.4 million, a statewide property tax of $7.24 per 1,000 would raise the amount of revenue needed to fund the formula, the proposed formula. And under this option, if towns did not increase their local contribution above the $5 minimum, 167 of 237 towns would see their overall property tax rates decline. I've also updated the simulator that I'll show you once we get through this to include an additional, if towns wanted to get back to their existing level of spending for those towns that are spending less or under the proposed formula than they're currently raising now, what additional property tax would get them back to their current level of spending or revenue. So here's some town by town examples. I updated the towns a little bit since last time to give the fiscal policy group some variety, but the idea remains the same. So the towns here are ordered in decreasing, or I guess increasing local revenue capacity. So if you look at Berlin, or Berlin, I think it's Berlin, not Berlin, Berlin. They raise, the formula says they should get 24 million. That amounts to $22,000 per student. Currently, they're actually raising $16,000 per student. That's more of a, just for your information. But if we apply a minimum local education tax of $5 per thousand, they'll be able to raise only 2 million on their own. So that means the remaining state obligation for Berlin would be 22 million, and 92% of Berlin's formula funding would be coming from the state. And if you added the $7.24 from the previous slide to their $5 minimum local education tax, they would be paying a tax rate of $12.24. Their actual combined education tax between the statewide property tax and the local education property tax is currently $17.42. So they would see their tax rate decline. Some of the districts or towns with higher capacity to raise their own revenue see the state share decline. So as you move down the list, you see that the state share falls from 92% to 77% in Barrington to 66% in Hooksett, all the way down to 0% in Wolfboro. So in Wolfboro, their total simulated formula funding is $9 million, or just under $13,000 per student. They can actually raise more from a $5 minimum local education tax than the $9 million that they're owed through their formula. So their minimum local education tax rate is actually less than $5. And this is another change that I've made since presenting to the fiscal policy work group. So rather than making them pay the $5 and raising more than the proposed formula funding, they can set their minimum local education tax to $4.05 and exactly raise the simulated formula funding. And under this example, none of the state remaining obligation is $0, so none of the dollars to fund the simulated formula are coming from state revenue. And the simulated combined education tax is actually less than the $12.24, assuming that Wolfboro sticks to their minimum local education tax of $4.05. So I'll pause there for 1 second and see if anyone has any questions about this before moving on to the next example.
Questions for Drew?
Dave, I've got a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Drew, thanks very much. I have two brief questions. One is the total simulated formula funding column. It's important to note, I think, that those numbers are being generated by prior work that you've presented to us, which is based on the quality and outcomes that are generated in New Hampshire, and suggesting that based on the local communities that the, trying to hit the standard goal of quality and outcome would require, under your model, spending that amount total in these communities. So this is not like the past models in New Hampshire, which have been on a kind of cost up basis, where you calculate how much should be spent in each district by looking at the cost of teachers, looking at the cost of transportation, looking at the cost of CTE. This is a quality outcomes measure that is generated really in a kind of revolutionary change for New Hampshire by reference to the kind of outcomes that are desired to be achieved in each particular district. And I want you to confirm this, with the result that quote unquote adequacy, or this total target, total spending target, differs dramatically or significantly, materially in each district on a per pupil basis. So the Berlin total simulated formula funding would, on a per pupil basis, would be much higher than a Wolfboro total simulated formula funding on a per pupil basis. That's my first, question to you, so that I get grounded in this presentation. That number comes not from the simulation model, but from a prior presentation, and it calculates things on quality outcome rather than cost up. Is that correct?
Yes. So the total simulated formula funding and the simulated formula funding per pupil are based on our education cost function model, and then the calculation of weight. So these are, when we go over to the simulator tool, the simulated per pupil funding that you see here is based on the weights that we developed from our cost model. And like Bill mentioned, the weights are designed to allow each district to achieve a common outcome, or provide the opportunity to achieve a common outcome. And the weights vary according to free and reduced price lunch, English learner status, special education, district size, and grade ranges. So that's why you see the simulated formula funding per pupil varying across districts. So the districts with higher costs and higher need will receive a higher amount per pupil.
Excellent. I thank you. One more question, Dave, just to follow up. Sure. Drew, could you go back a slide?
Yep.
This slide indicates that the total state budget share of the total amount spent would be about 68%. That is the 2 billion 9 million number divided by the 2.9 billion number. In Massachusetts, when we look at it, the total state spending is only 38% of the total amount spent on public education. Could you try and describe for me what the difference is between this simulation, and which has a very high state spending as a state budget share as a percentage of total spending, compared to Massachusetts, which has more common in New England, a much lower state budget share as a share of the total?
Yeah, I mean, you can, using the simulator, which I'll show you in a second, you can very easily change those assumptions. So this is an example of $5 minimum local contribution per thousand. If you wanted to say that the state only needs to raise 40% or 35%, you could change this $5 minimum local contribution up to $8 or $10. So as you increase the minimum local contribution, the state, the proportion that remains the responsibility of state revenue decreases. As you see here, though, as you increase the minimum local contribution, you're going to get more and more districts that are going to fall into this Wolfboro category, where the entire amount of their simulated formula funding will be able to be covered by the minimum local contribution. So you can see that Wolfboro's minimum local contribution, because it can pay the entire amount, is only $4.05, whereas the other district, their minimum local contribution is the full $5 minimum local contribution. So as you increase the minimum local contribution, there's gonna be more districts that fall into this Wolfboro category, which is gonna, those districts will have a lower minimum local contribution, which is in effect going to increase the burden, even though it's far more equitable than what's currently happening. the higher need districts, the higher poverty districts, it will in effect increase the burden for them. So you can see that the burden for Wolfboro is at $11.29. The burden for the rest of them is at $12.24. So as you increase the minimum local contribution, this $12.24 will go up, because there's going to be more districts like Wolfboro who are not going to contribute that full $12.24.
So Iris, I see. Bill, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
So hang on, Iris, just for a second, just something for clarification, because I think I just heard it wrong. Is the minimum local considered state dollars or local dollars?
Local dollars.
Okay. Okay.
So if Wolfboro chooses to raise their local education property tax to more than $4.05, then that's fine. Under the current policy, there's nothing stopping them from doing that. They'll be able to retain whatever revenue they raise by increasing it above $4.05.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thanks. Iris, sorry about that.
Thank you. I have a two-part quick question. Well, first of all, does the state have the authority to mandate that there be a minimum local education tax? And I'm also having trouble understanding what the difference is between that and just raising the statewide property tax. And the second part of my question is the simulator able to in some way be structured to allow us to consider different, I don't know if you call them circuit breakers or whatever, income sensitivities or some modifications to the statewide property tax?
Thank you for those questions. I mean, there's not a whole lot conceptually different between the minimum local education tax and the statewide property tax. Like I said in response to Bill's comment, one key difference is that if you keep raising the minimum local education tax, then you do have more and more of these districts like Wolfboro that are gonna be able to raise more than the minimum based on the minimum local education tax. And so it does, I mean, in my opinion, there's actually some inequities that are introduced through this minimum local education tax that aren't introduced when you do a full statewide property tax. And that's the next example that I'll get to. Regarding your, let me see, what was your second point? It was,
well, on my first point also, I'm not sure that the state has the authority.
Yeah, I mean, regarding constitutionality, I think that's up to the commission to determine whether they think that will fly in the courts. I'm not a New Hampshire Constitution expert, and I think there's probably some leeway in the interpretation, and I think that will be up to you.
Okay, and the second part was about whether the simulator could in any way,
oh yeah,
you know, yeah, you remember.
Yeah, right. So admittedly, this is a very simple scenario, and there are a lot of complexities, and I probably should have led off with this, but these are very simple scenarios, and there's a lot of information that we don't have in terms of income of residents and things like that. So admittedly, the scenarios that we can do on the revenue side are limited, but hopefully they provide at least a flavor of the possibilities. And there are certainly some considerations that the commission will have to make on the side. So this is very basic and not meant to capture all the complexities of the revenue side.
Thanks, Drew. And Iris, I think to that second part of your second question with regards to like circuit breakers, I think we heard from the DRA that's going to be a harder thing to simulate than this, because it's harder to sort of connect all the data for that. So, but I think it's certainly going to be an important part of did I freeze? Did everybody freeze?
I'm still hearing you.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
It's certainly going to have to be a big piece of our work over the next 3 months. No question about it.
Thanks.
Yeah, Val.
Yeah, just a clarification. So on the minimum local contribution, am I correct in assuming that as that number goes up, the whole funding mechanism becomes increasingly regressive? And that the
No.
lower that is, it becomes more progressive?
So, well, I mean, I think there's two sides of the coin here we're talking about. One side is the formula funding side. So that's the amount that we're saying districts should receive through the formula, and that consists of both the state revenue and the minimum local revenue. And this formula side is fixed. That's not changing regardless of what revenue scenarios we put in place. On the revenue side, there's also taxpayer equity issues. And you are correct that when the further you raise the minimum local education tax, there are some slight inequities that are introduced by having more districts that can raise more than enough through the minimum local education tax. So as you have more districts that can raise the full amount of funding through their local sources, that means that more of the burden falls on the districts that can't raise their full revenue through local sources. And you can see that more when we go to the simulator, and I can show you how that works a little bit better in the simulator.
Great. Does that help out, Val?
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like the situation we currently have now with a fixed amount allocated to the statewide property tax is effectively increasing the minimum contribution every year. So we've already defined our current system as becoming incredibly regressive. So you could effectively, with the model, sort of simulate what we have now and show the change in equity, at least from the taxpayer side, by using our current $300 and some million statewide property tax and moving up and down that scale to show how the slope of that line that showed regressivity would change with changes here. I would think there'd be some sort of optimization mechanism you could put in place, linear programming or something, which would probably show where you try to minimize the impact rather than picking things at random. There may be another mathematical implement to use to try to calculate what that would be.
I mean, it's gonna.
Dave, can I just jump?
Okay, hang on. Did Drew have a response to that first?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a sliding scale. I don't think there's going to be any optimization that happens. I think it's going to fall down to whether how much the state thinks it can impose in a statewide property tax, and whether that will be felt differently than imposing a minimum local education tax. But the other point I was going to make is in an extreme example, if let's say you set the minimum local contribution to $30, then every district would be able to raise the entire amount through their minimum local contribution, and then you would end up with all districts varying in their actual tax rates to raise the amount that's proposed. So that's kind of the extreme example. And as you increase the minimum local contribution, you're moving more toward that extreme example where all districts are just going to have varying tax rates to raise the exact amount that they need.
But I see what Val's saying too. I mean, and I'm not looking at our current tax data right now, but if you've got some towns that are paying, let's say, 28 per thousand and some -3 per thousand in ed taxes, that maybe you could do a solve for bringing those two numbers closer together. Pick what that number is.
Right. There's a tool in Excel. I used to use this on this kind of simulation. And you guys could use it even with the simulation as is. There's a tool called the Solver. It's part of the analysis tools pack.
It's called GoalSeek now. GoalSeek.
Right, GoalSeek. Yeah. So you use the Solver tool, and you basically say, set this value to minimum, whatever, to minimize the difference between the dependent value in something by changing X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C. So you can pick 3, 4, 5 different values that get manipulated to minimize, maximize, whatever you want to do on the outcome value, and use that tool. I think Drew makes a really important point that there may be a significant difference between the political optimization and the mathematical optimization. That they're going to be, and I think you guys can probably already see a lot of that. And well, what would be the politically bearable maximum on the simulated minimum local? Yeah,
I don't have them on my screen, but I imagine Mel's going enough geeking out right now. Bill?
I wanted to just check on something that Val said. Val, when you talked about the graph that shows we have the most regressive distribution, or one of the most in the country, that's talking about column 1 here. That's not talking about the tax equity part. And I'm asking for the AIR people to correct me if I'm wrong. The total simulated formula funding is not going to change as a result of us playing these GoalSeek games. That distribution is designed to move us from an F, which we're getting on a number of national studies in terms of total spending distribution, to something better, like Massachusetts gets a B. But I wanted to confirm, Val, by fooling with the tax guts of the simulator, we're not changing this formula distribution, which is the targeted need-based aid system, unless I'm wrong. And I'm inviting the AR guys to hammer me.
You're 100% right on that. The column 1 and 2, the first 2 columns here of numbers, are based on our empirical analysis, our cost models that came up with cost targets to provide adequate, based on the outcome goals, kind of equal opportunity to achieve the adequate outcomes. So that, and maybe you can think of, what could we label those first 2 columns differently to point out that those are empirically driven, cost-based targets of providing equal opportunity and adequacy. The first one is total, the second one is per pupil. Those don't change. Those are driven by the research we've done. If we were to update the models, decide on different outcome goals, then those might change. But once we've set them in the simulation, they don't. So now we're just trying to tweak tax policy in different ways such that districts can raise that target funding. And we're trying to find ways to raise it by equitable tax policy, ideally.
So David,
hang on a second, because Chris has had her hand raised for a while, and I had my participants panel off my screen. I've now put it back on a different screen. So Chris, you want to come in on this?
Yeah. So building on this last point, I guess why this is just a step in the process is because it's regression to the mean of outcomes. I mean, that would seem the concern to me, that this is set, if I'm right in what I've read of what you've done, this is set to average outcomes. So this would mean that there's no reason for us to think that Portsmouth and Wolfboro no longer want to have high achievement. Mm-hmm. Others who don't may want to have higher achievement, but I think I worry about getting too fixated on these things, because this gives everybody state average outcomes, doesn't raise the bar for everyone. It actually reduces the bar. Is that correct?
Well, you're absolutely correct in that it shoots for, the cost estimates are based on what would it cost in each district to achieve existing average state outcomes. So the real focus here is on generating the revenue to raise those spending levels in the places that are well below that to move toward that. The method behind what's in the first two columns does allow you or us or in some collaborate to go back and figure out, well, now how do we start ratcheting up those outcomes overall, right? How can we shoot for higher targets, knowing that shooting for higher targets is going to cost more overall as well. So this is kind of like a modest starting point to, as Bill was saying, kind of move the overall distribution from an F to a B or an A on the grid, get it so that we're at least moving the resources up in places like Berlin and Manchester, where presently they have much greater needs and lower funding.
So would it be fair to say then, Bruce, that if rather than state average outcomes, you wanted to look, I mean, just do see what the expenditure would be if we wanted Portsmouth level outcomes.
Yeah.
We would bring,
does it.
we would bring the simulated calculated expense up to Portsmouth's current expense by scaling the that base factor, right?
So as Chris, this is an excellent point, and as Bill just mentioned, the simulator already has that functionality built in.
Yep.
So I think the sobering conversation though is, if you want to increase outcomes, how much are you willing to pay? Because the simulator will provide you with how much more that's going to cost, right? So this is it's a novel functionality of the simulator, and it's really important to have this. I mean, in several other states, it's almost even a non-starter because the context in many other states, which are far lower spending than yours, is that they have to spend a lot more just to provide sort of a basic adequacy level, right? And in your case, you guys are already spending a relatively high amount. It's just distributed in a fashion that's not allowing everybody to get to those high levels of achievement. So it's great to be in a state where we can have this honest conversation, right? Where we don't have to say, oh, you have to spend 20% more. And that's the starting of the conversation. Here, you're talking about, well, you're already spending a lot. Let's see what it would cost to spend if we spent, let's see what it would cost to reach a higher level of achievement for everybody. So Chris, excellent point. We're going to get there once the simulator is kind of unveiled here, and you can see that functionality. It's very simple to use as well.
So the last point I want to make on this is that there's nothing prohibiting Portsmouth from getting back to that $17,635 per student. They would just have to raise that through additional local taxes. So right now their tax rate is at the minimum tax rate that they would assess themselves is $12.24. Previously, they were only paying $6.48. If they want to get back to $17,600, there's nothing stopping them from doing that under current policy. That's another policy question of whether we want to allow districts to raise more or not, but they could raise this $12.24 to $13.24 and get back to $17,600 if they wanted to.
Right. I see some new hand raised. Jay?
Thank you, David. So I'm wanting to get some context back for myself and folks on the conversation, like John Beardmore and his Commissioner of Revenue Administration hat, and others who probably recall some of this can help me out. One thing that's clear to me is that the conversation we just had, these are just costs driven to the mean in the first column of total simulated. The simulated minimum local tax, it's under local control, so that's going to get set to wherever the local community wants it ultimately. And then, so the next column I'm looking to then is the simulated combined education tax. It's just a model, but in 2008, and until the state put not a rate cap for the state property tax, but put a dollar cap on the total amount raised, trying to go back to when it was the rate. What was that rate when originally the statewide property tax was introduced?
I think it was
Here
660.
It was 660.
660, yeah.
Yeah.
It's where,
I mean,
it's where the utility tax still is, Jeff.
Right, right.
that's an okay. They missed that opportunity, but for all other rates, it started at 660. This, I mean, we could play with this model in any manner. We could go back to what that was, set it at 660 to whatever the offset would be to get to this 1224. I guess that the point is, and I guess that's where you were going with the simulator. The simulator will allow us to adjust these amounts for either holding total spending constant in a district, holding allowing their local tax rate to float, and then setting a state tax rate. That, I mean, we can play with those three variables, right?
Yeah, I mean, right now we have it so that you vary the local tax and then the state tax calculates itself, but you could play around with the local tax until you get to close to 660 and figure out what that would be. So yeah, that wouldn't be hard to do using the simulator.
Thanks.
Let's see, Mel, was that a hand?
Yeah, yes. Just a basic question. The first two columns, the total simulated formula funding and the simulated per pupil, I'm assuming that these are based upon the weights that AIR has calculated to provide, you know, the weights like when we were dealing with, you know, the poverty, when we're dealing with rural nature, the whole characterization of the school district, that those weights are what are driving these particular figures. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. So the weights that we estimated are used to calculate those first two columns.
And the weights are based upon your assessment of all the data that you.
Yeah, Mel froze a little bit, but yes, I think he was asking whether it was based on our education cost model. And yeah, so this is based on our education cost model, which is designed to estimate the cost of achieving a common set of outcomes across all districts. And then using that, the results of that, then we estimate the weights, which vary, or which allow this funding to vary across districts according to their characteristics. So how many free and reduced price lunch students districts have, how many English learners, special education students, small districts get more funding than larger districts, et cetera.
But importantly, Drew, it has that what you're calling your cost model is really an outcomes model, because you have outcome data like test scores and achievement and graduation rates and things like that from that earlier presentation, but then you're building in, you're valuing those differences using various weightings. Am I wrong in that? Because that's not in the simulator. That's in some other spreadsheet.
So the cost model includes outcomes, but allows us to hold those outcomes constant. So when we hold those outcomes constant, then we see these differences in funding across districts. And these differences in funding across districts, once you hold outcomes constant, are due to those other characteristics that we talked about. It's more difficult for a district with high amounts of special education students to achieve a given outcome. It's more difficult for a district with higher amounts of free and reduced price lunch students and English learners to achieve a given outcome. So once we hold that outcome constant, then you see the variation according to these other characteristics.
And I'd like to just point out kind of a quick follow-up, and I think Drew is going to show this functionality. We can base the calculations, base the number to average, but we can move that bar up or down and see how that affects those targets, and then the tax policy implications of hitting those targets. And Drew has added that functionality to the simulation to be able to move the bar up or down. I don't know if it down is in it, but Drew, I think
Can I just
that in at some point.
Can I just jump in as well, because Bill brought up a really good point, and I see Val really needs to say something as well. So I'm going to make it really quick, but indeed, our cost function model, our education cost function, it's the cost of producing outcomes, okay? It's not an input-based model. It's not the cost of specific inputs. It's the cost of achieving outcomes conditional, that is given the various needs and circumstances districts operate under. Okay, so it is an outcomes model, but we call this a cost function in economics. It's the cost of producing something, and in this case, it is student outcomes that we are producing. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out.
No, thanks, Jesse.
And
Hey,
Dave,
hang on, I just want to. I want to get Val real quick.
Just to get changing this a little, just an interpretation. So I'm looking down at Wolfboro. They're currently paying $751. Under the new mechanism, they would be paying $1129. So it's a 50% increase in their taxes. And at that point, they would be paying less than what they're paying per pupil, or they would be getting less than what they're getting per pupil now. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
But Wolfboro also raises a lot of dollars without much increase in their local taxes, so they could get back to that 23,000 with an additional local education tax if they elected to do that.
Sure.
So that's going to be a point that I mean, I think Drew mentioned it earlier, that we'll need to be talking about at fiscal policy and at the full commission on what sort of policies do we want to consider surrounding mandatory minimum, if we're going to be doing a mandatory minimum. What would be the policies surrounding that, and also what would be the policies surrounding a local ed tax too, if there were any. Bill?
Yeah, I wanted to follow on Jesse's point. So Jesse, in the past, New Hampshire has always used an input type approach where you kind of cost up. So you use what's the cost of a teacher's salary, what's the cost of a benefit package, an average, blah, 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 and you add it up, and you get to a number that is your base adequacy, and you fool around with it. I just wanted to emphasize to the commission that first column is computed conceptually very different, almost, from trying to equalize outcomes. So that's important. That's why I was emphasizing it. And I appreciate at some point, if we were to adopt it, we'd have to define adequacy by outcomes. We'd have to value adequacy by this type of cost function, economic cost function method, which is unbelievably different than what we've done, Jay, on the adequacy work group when we're trying to say, what's the right cost to add up? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, for laying that out. And yeah, I want to pile onto that too for a second, and then do a quick time check. But yeah, I mean, our current funding model based on inputs is actually what the court said I think what the court said we don't have to do it that way, that we don't have to have horizontal resource replication where everybody gets whatever it is, $4,700 per pupil on average. And there's not too much difference from whatever that average per pupil cost is on a per district basis. It hugs that number, pretty tightly. You can really see from AIR's analysis based on their regression work that it varies significantly based on the disparities in districts. So this is a very different way of looking at expenditure costing than we've looked at in the past. And So anyway, hey, a little bit of a time check. We've got about 20 minutes left in this segment. We've used up 40 going through this. I think we want to give time for the simulator. Bruce, is this a good time to move over to that?
Let's let Drew just simply just show the other option, just so folks.
Oh, yeah, of course.
People can then look at it on their own.
And we've had a lot of, this has been robust discussion on this. It certainly applies to the next.
Yeah, exactly. And Jay has his hand up as well, so let's.
Okay, yep. So Drew, then Jay.
Quickly.
All right, yeah, the next scenario is just what would it look like if everything came from state revenue, there was no minimum local contribution rate. And this is very similar in nature to the last scenario, so I don't think I have to go into everything in detail. But the important thing is that you do see this tax rate go down from, I think it was around $12.40 to $12.05, and that's because there's no longer those Wolfboro scenarios that are raising more than they need to from their local education tax. Everyone's paying the same tax rate across the board, $12.05. So whereas Wolfboro was paying $11 and something before, now Wolfboro is paying $12.05. That additional tax rate for those property wealthy districts ends up lowering the tax rates for those other districts that have to pay the entire local contribution. So this is just another example of what you can do in the simulator. So I don't think it's important to dwell on this, but I think it would be a good opportunity to move over to the simulator, but I'll let Jay ask his question.
And just for clarification, Drew, both these examples that you've shown are basically showing revenue coming from a state property tax, in this case, the non-state revenues of $601 million, which I think is, sort of what's currently being done. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think Dick pointed out that it was actually around $650 million, and I was using FY 2019 and FY 20 is $650 million, but you can play around with that in the simulator as well. If you think you're going to come up with more revenue from some other tax, you can add that assumption in and raise the 602 million to 900 million or whatever you think you'll be able to raise.
Right, but these illustrations use, I think you said 601 million in non-state property tax state revenues. And if you wanted to simulate something else, you just put it in there.
Yep.
Okay, great. Jay? Sorry.
Thanks. I just feel like I need to clarify some things about the adequacy and distribution work group. First off, we have spent no time on developing a cost-based model. We spent time understanding the various cost-based models that exist. So the reason why we haven't spent any time on developing an independent or playing with all those variables that were pointed out is because we contracted with AIR to give us an outcome-based model. Second point I wanted to make is that an outcome-based or performance-based model is not new for New Hampshire. We just haven't applied it to our funding formula. But indeed, the adequate education statutes, that chapter in statute, under the performance-based measures, uses the variables that AIR has used in this study. So the variables of standardized testing, attendance, and graduation rates are all included as part of the current statute on performance-based measures. And the third point is that still on the table are things around categorical aid that we still need to consider. Things like special education or CTE transportation and assistance to charter schools. I mean, these are all things that are outside of the adequacy formula, still part of the dollars that are raised through the Education Trust Fund and all of the funding sources there, and why this $601 million here is different from the total appropriation from the Education Trust Fund, because those categorical aid amounts would still exist even with this adequacy formula. So just wanted to clarify where we are, and things that we'll continue to need to sort out, at least provide definitions of what those different sources are for references, the references that currently exist that relate to this.
No, thanks. That's really good clarification, Jay.
Dave, if I could jump in, I've had my hand up for a while, but I guess
I'm sorry. I wasn't on my screen. Sorry.
I know. And Jay's provided me with an opportunity to get back into this. It's really to observe that the AAR formula, the education, costing of education part of it, is dependent on the use of 3 measures of outcome. And Jay mentioned those 3. And basically that's because that's what we got. There aren't other good measures, at least that's what they found, that are sufficiently credible, usable to rest a formula on. So we're resting on these 3 variables, measures of outcome. We're also looking, I think they also tested this against a larger multi-state indicator. But I think one of the tasks for Jay and the adequacy work group is to dig into this and see if we're comfortable resting our case on those indicators of outcome, because that's essentially what we're doing. So that's my observation.
No, thanks, Dick. Yeah, and I think we've talked about this as well. That obviously this is a bit of a work in progress right here, and particularly with the simulator, and also I think it's going to be important that the adequacy work group take a very careful look at the more complicated scenarios that are out there, like the Hanover-Norwich district and the co-ops, Pinkerton Academy, things like that, where it's not quite as easy peasy as it is in a lot of other districts. And I don't mean to say it that way, but it's a more complicated revenue expense model that involves tuition dollars and stuff like that, and so having that careful look at particularly those edge cases, I think is going to be really important to validate the expenditure scenarios. So. Fair enough. Anything else on this, Jay? Did you want to take the last word on it before we go over to the simulator?
I don't. I'm good.
All right. Back to you, Drew.
All right. There's one more slide of considerations, but I'll let you look at that. I think we've talked through a lot of those considerations in our discussion already. Let me share just a couple things. So first, before we get to the actual simulator, I want to share, can you all see the documentation sheet? So we put together a documentation of the simulator. So this is new for this week. So if you haven't read this, it's helpful in talking about what's in the simulator and how it works. But I don't need to go through this other than to show you that it exists for the moment, because I'll be walking through the simulator itself. But I just wanted to point out that this is here and should have been, I think, shared with you all through either email or on the CARSI website. And here is the simulator. So there were a couple changes since last week. One of the big changes was including this outcome, but I'll walk through all these different toggles. So the yellow cells here, the gold cells are the ones that users can change. Everything else is locked. The commission was provided with information on how to unlock things, but for now you can't click on anything other than these gold cells. So for the first one, you can select whether you want transportation in the formula or outside of the formula. So if you select yes, that means that the weights and the base are intended to account for transportation in addition to everything else, all the other current expenses. If you select no, you'll notice that the base drops and the weights change a little bit, and that's so that transportation can be pulled outside of the formula and distributed separately through the categorical program. So that's one option that you have available to you. Here's the new toggle that we added this week. It allows you to change the outcome from the state average to a different assumed outcome, and you can go up or down. But let's say we want to achieve the 75th percentile rather than the state average. You see that the base per pupil goes up about $700 per student, and along with the rest of the weights, that amount increases the total spending over here. So it was, I think, 2.9 billion before, and now it's 3.25 billion. So you added about $300 million in revenue by going from the average to the 75th percentile. The weights don't change, it's just a change to the base based on a percentage increase to the assumed outcome. You can add a assumed yearly percentage. So this was done for two reasons. Most of our data is based on FY19. So to get it to FY20, which is where we can compare to at least existing levels of the most recent reported expenditures, you can increase the base. So we increased it by 2.5% here as our base scenario. So that's what our model increased, was the typical increase over time to maintain outcomes. So so a 2.5% increase would probably be something typical from year to year. So moving forward, you can continue to increase this by however much you think is appropriate, and that will, and as you increase the percentage, it increases the base. Here you can select whether you want to use the recommended weights, which are already in place, and which are the weights that were developed through our analysis, or you can input your own custom weights. So you can select recommended or custom. Since there are no weights input at the moment, they're all assumed to be zero. So every district would get the exact same amount, which would be $17,279. So that's also the average amount that we're saying will be appropriated through our formula. So that's kind of the input side. Over here is the revenue side. Here's where you would change the minimum local contribution. So let's say we wanted to change it to $8.50. So then if you change it to $8.50, the state tax rate would go down to $4.40. So if we wanted to get to that 660, maybe it would be somewhere around $6 minimum local contribution. So you can change the minimum local contribution there. You can also change the amount that you're raising from other sources other than statewide property taxes. So if you thought you were going to raise an additional 300 million here, let's say we're going to raise 900 million in total, you can see how that affects the property tax rate. So that would lower the state tax rate. Down at the bottom, I have it set so that we're only showing these districts, but these filter functions work. So you can select whatever districts you want to see. And then you can see the different variables for each of these districts. So these light green cells are the elements that contribute toward the simulated funding. So these are really calculating the weighted ADM, which is in column T here. To convert weighted ADM to formula funding, you simply multiply the weighted ADM by the base amount per pupil, which was above. The simulated ratio of weighted to actual ADM is kind of a measure of relative cost across districts or relative need. So the higher this ratio is, the more funding per pupil they'll get. And to calculate per pupil funding from this ratio, you simply multiply the ratio by the base cost. So here in these light blue cells, we have the total simulated formula funding and the formula funding per pupil, which you saw in the slides that I presented earlier. So these are calculated in response to changing the weights that are above and the expected outcome and the percentage increase over time. And I also added in actual revenue from current the adequacy grant, local property tax revenue, and state property tax revenue, so you can compare simulated to actual. And then in these light pink cells, you see the revenue variables. So a bunch of these revenue variables were presented earlier in the slides, but you have your minimum local education tax. And because we raised the minimum local education tax from the example before, now Portsmouth is in the category of being able to raise all of their local revenue, all of their revenue from the minimum local education tax. So they have no remaining state obligation. You can see the percentage of funding from the state, and then the simulated statewide property tax and the combined education tax rate. And then there's a few variables that show actual tax rates. Column AF is an added variable from last week that shows the additional local education property tax that would be required to get them to actual. So for any district that has actual spending above our formula funding, you can see the amount of additional local education taxes that would get them back to their current level. So Portsmouth would only require 69 cents per thousand to get them back to their current level of funding. Wolfboro would require an additional $3.46 per thousand. Barrington and Berlin raise more through our proposed funding formula than what they're actually spending, so they wouldn't have to raise anything more to get them back to their actual levels. And then you can see a couple of columns that show the difference between actual education taxes and simulated education taxes.
When you mean actual, you mean FY20?
Yes.
Okay.
Or I think it's actually FY19 because 18-19 was the most current that was on the Department of Education website.
Okay.
But to that point, I also added a variable list, which doesn't look great, but it's probably very useful. But it has the source of all of the data elements, either as a website or a calculation. So if you have any questions about where this number came from, you can go to here and find the source. In response to some other comments last week that said the main cost simulator was just too much to look at and it was too wide, we separated out a few of the elements into separate sheets to make it more concise and easy to scroll through. So in this sheet is a few elements that are critical for the calculation of formula funding and the weighted pupils. In the revenue excerpt sheet is a set of variables that are critical to calculating revenues and comparing our simulated revenues to actual revenue or actual tax rates. And then I also added a a scatter plot. Oh, it's because I filtered. I was wondering why it looks so funny, but it's because I filtered. But it shows the districts and a fit line of how much the relationship between free and reduced price lunch and formula funding per pupil. So if we go over here, let's add back all the districts. You can see the variation in per pupil formula funding per student, and the fit line with the free and reduced price lunch percentage. And if we change the weights to custom weights and add some different values here, you can go back and see the FRL scatter and see how it affects, how your assumed weights affect the relationship between free and reduced price lunch and formula funding. So I'll stop there, and I don't know if you want to allow time for questions.
Yeah, let's take a few, and then we're going to have to. Then I think we're going to want to go into public comment. But members of the commission that have questions, Chris.
Well, the only weight that I was really curious about is middle school. Can you shed any light on that?
So what is your question? Why is the middle school weight as high as it is?
Exactly.
So these are, I mean, we did look at that a little bit, and my guess, and remember that these weights are all interacting with each other. So if you have, if districts with lots of middle school students also tend to be small districts, like if they're K-8 districts, or if they're 6 to 12 districts, they might typically be small districts if they have a higher percentage of middle school students. So that might be a result of districts with lots of middle school students being a little bit smaller than typical. We did look at the set of districts that had particularly high middle school percentages, and they did tend to be those either K-8 districts or 6 to 12 districts. So if maybe it's a result of districts that don't serve the full range of grades being slightly costlier than districts that do serve the full range of grades. So I'm not sure that it actually has anything to do with providing additional services to middle school students, or if, as opposed to it being a response to the characteristics of districts that tend to have high percentages of middle school students.
Mm-hmm. So Jay, then Rick.
If I can posit one other option, Drew, I'd like your reaction to this. If our school outcomes are different in third grade as in fourth and fifth, as compared to sixth through eighth, then if our performance, either the spread on performance is greater or the average is lower, then one of those two could influence it, probably the first one. That if the distribution around the mean on average test scores for middle school varies greater than it does at third grade, then that would influence the amount needed to reach the average outcome in sixth through eighth, right?
Yeah, for sure. So it's a good. I
think that's a really thoughtful catch there. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that if we're trying to deal with a biennial budget that's really going to be 20 and 21, and there is that kind of reset that needs to happen for that biennial budget based on inflationary factors. If we're lagging 1 year behind that, or a couple years behind that, we're going to need to use that inflation weight to adjust the average pupil expense, right?
Right. So if you're appropriating 2 years at a time, you might calculate what it would cost in year one with a 2.5% inflation rate. And then in year two, you could add an additional 2.5% on top of that to calculate a year two amount. So it's kind of compounding inflation rates that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, you would have to adjust that inflation rate appropriately for each year that we're talking about.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Jay. Rick?
Thank you, Dave. I had several questions here. One, is there an assumption here that transportation is not going to be included within the columns on the left-hand side where I see the weights and all that? I'm seeing transportation over there hooked up with catastrophic aid, which is not part of our adequacy formula right now. That's one question. The other question I have deals with special education and how we're weighting there. You can certainly have a resource kid that's very little costs associated with that other than a resource room teacher, takes them during reading or math, whatever, but then you can have some other students which are really high demand youngsters. But it looks to me like we're counting every special ed child there as on this particular example, a 4.29, which is a heavy value.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Our ideal scenario would be to have multiple special ed categories, and we went through we worked a long time to try and get data that would allow us to disaggregate that special ed into different categories of special education students based on need. And after a lot of effort trying to get that special education data, it didn't come. So unfortunately, we only have one special ed variable that encaptures all special education students. If you look at some of the literature that we provided with the national scan, a common thing that states do is to have multiple special education weights that try to account for variation in student needs and the costs of special education students with different severities of need. But we just couldn't do it with the data that we had.
So I just want to make a quick comment on that. The Department of Education has been very helpful and very supportive and very cooperative on this. There was some reservation to accessing the disaggregated data for special education, given we're a small state with a lot of small districts. And you know, I for one, having chaired a school board for a long time, certainly understand the importance of protecting the privacy of our kiddos. So
Yeah. I don't really get it, because back in 07, 08, we were able to differentiate that by placement. So I don't understand why we can't do it now. And that was part of the reason they went with that pupil identifier number system. So I don't understand what the hang up is, and I think it's something we really need. I don't understand how we can weight every special ed kid that highly.
Yeah, I think it's terribly important, given when you look at how high the percentages of identification are when you scan that list, and the variation in identification would maybe be of interest to see if you could give us some data from other states, because I think we're known as a state that has high identification rates anyway, but it seems like it would be especially important to do that for that.
So Drew, would it be fair to say, if we were to try to split this out based on maybe other experience you've seen, that you'd see some special education weights higher than what this is and some lower than what this is?
Yeah, so this would be an average special education rate, right? So if we were able to split this out, you would expect that the more severe students would have a higher weight and the less severe students would have a lower weight, but this would be interpreted as the average coefficient across all special education students. So if the incidence of severity is relatively constant across districts or across towns, then this isn't a problem. Where it becomes a problem is if the incidence of severity does vary substantially across towns. But I would also point out that we took out the catastrophic aid from the formula. So there's a separate pot of money that's designed to be distributed to districts to help them deal with or help them serve students with particularly high needs.
Right. So while the weight appears to be high, it was born out of the data, and that it would certainly reflect the average anyway. So
yeah.
Yeah, but average here might not be what you want to look at, because the distribution of needs is not, you know, you have a high, the low incidence is going to be high cost, right? And you're going to have many more students of like learning disabilities and high incidence with low cost. So I'm not sure average is what we want.
Well,
no. But what I'm saying is if you looked at all of that and factored all of that in, you'd still come up with this average. I agree that that number doesn't apply to every student, but a lot of these weights aren't going to apply to every, you know, student in a perfect sense. But you know,
I think Drew said it. I mean, to the extent that the distribution of students with respect to disability and severity is different across districts, then this becomes a problem. To the extent that you have the same distribution across districts, then this number wouldn't change even if you broke it out, right? You'd still come up with similar cost calculations for each district.
Exactly.
Right.
And I've got to believe that there's higher incidence of higher costs in certain communities.
Right. And let me just kind of clarify. Typically what we would do is, I mean, what we shoot for, and I think what we wanted to try to get here was two categories, where one, in a place where you might have 15 or 16% children with disabilities in the aggregate, 12 to 13% are still in LDBD-OHI. These kind of broad categories still covers most of it, and then you get these smaller percentages which may vary significantly, but we try to get them into those two groups. Here, in effect, we still have two groups, but the slice of greater severity is even smaller, more severe, and that we've held out the catastrophic to deal with separately. The other one point I want to make is it looks like, I mean, that 4.29 looks like a big weight when we think about it in the context of other weights in other states' formulas, but it's derived differently. And it's a big weight over a low base figure because of the way all of our model pieces fit together. So it's not like that 4.29 that we have in there is analogous to, for example, if we look back to all the old special ed expenditure studies that say the average special ed kid costs about 1.9 to 2.1 times the cost of the average kid. Well, this 4.29 number isn't the same kind of number as that. In fact, if we looked at the special ed expense compared to the average expense, it probably comes in more on the order of 2, but it's the special ed expense compared to a synthetic base expense with 0 additional needs. And it's 4.29 times that synthetic base. So the number, the 4.29, is not analogous to weights that we might see in other states' formulas. And yes, we would have liked to get it split into two groups that are more like LD, BD, OHI, and speech language in one, and then the others in the other. But we still have a bit of a two-group breakout in that we have the catastrophic and then kind of the big group.
So I want to be respectful of people's time. We're coming up on 4 o'clock. Still want to take public comment. What I would like to suggest is that we prosecute this line of inquiry with the adequacy work group, because I think it requires a deeper dive than we're going to be able to do this afternoon. Is that fair enough? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
I see a bunch of hands up, but I'm not. I hope they're not for questions to pursue this. I hope it's for something else. Rick.
Well, it was on that. I'm sorry. I think as Iris does, this material is available. It can get
Yeah,
just.
look, Rick, we're gonna take this at an adequacy work group.
Okay, that'd be wonderful. The other
Yeah.
question I did have though was what you're deciding as your performance outcome, 75%, 60%, 100%. I'd like to know what Massachusetts is doing. If they're spending less dollars on a statewide basis, but getting a better performance, an outcome, a quality outcome, then I'd like to know what they're looking at as their performance indicators.
Okay. I think Drew showed us some examples of that, but I think that's something we can dig in at inadequacy as well. I think that's a really good point. Anything else along these lines, Val?
Yeah, just real quick, my interpretation of that base is that it's a mathematical artifact of your regression formula. It has nothing to do with an updated version of the adequacy formula that we currently have. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't, I think what we're proposing is substantially different from the formula that is currently in there. And yeah, I mean, it does represent the hypothetical cost for a district that has no needs indicated by the bases or by the weights that we have there. There are no districts that have no needs additional to the base. And when we look at the range of expenditures per student based on our formula, they run from around $12,500 per student to $30,000 per student, which is very similar to the range that currently exists in New Hampshire and is very similar to what the Conval folks indicated should be an appropriate minimum. So I think we're in the ballpark of expectations here, despite thinking about it a little bit differently.
Great. Thanks, Drew, and thanks, Val, for that question. Iris, I see Iris's hand is still up. Is that a new question or is that an artifact from?
An artifact.
Okay, thanks. We're gonna take up more of this stuff at work groups, but we're ready to sort of open it up to attendees that may have to share a comment with the commission. So Jordan, can I hand it over to you to sort of let us know what's going on, let people in?
Yeah, no problem. So folks, if you're following along on a computer or the app, you can click the hand raise button. Otherwise, if you're on a phone, you can hit *9. I see Jeff McLynch has his hand raised currently, so we will bring him in now. Jeff, welcome.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate being recognized given the lateness of the hour, so I'll try to be especially brief. For the record, my name's Jeff McLynch. I'm the project director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. I really wanted to thank the Commission for its really detailed and rich conversation today, and thank AIR as well for all the work that they've done since this simulator was originally presented. The refinements that they've made, I think, have helped to clarify one issue that I think is particularly important to the Commission as it moves forward, which is to say that when this information was originally presented and option 1 was described, it wasn't entirely clear what might happen in those situations in which a district or a community with a local contribution that exceeded its formula funding, what would happen to those dollars, whether they'd be retained locally or returned to the, or still collected by the state. It seems that with the clarifications that were provided today, you would end up with a situation in which those communities would have a lower minimum local contribution. If that's the case, I would be concerned that that approach, the sort of minimum local contribution option 1, would simply serve to perpetuate the disparities to one degree or another that we see in the current approach to fiscal policy as it relates to education funding, with some property wealthy districts having very low effective school tax rates and some property poor districts having very high rates. And I guess in that context, I would just want to provide
the members of the commission with two reminders. The first is we've testified previously about prior education litigation, in particular the court's ruling in the second Claremont case, and I just want to cite that here. And they found that to the extent the property tax is used in the future to fund the provision of an adequate education, the tax must be administered in a manner that is equal in valuation and uniform in rate throughout the state. And I'd be concerned that if you had varying minimum local contributions, you would not meet that level of uniformity. That sort of same language about uniformity in revenue sources is found in the commission's own charge, the enabling legislation, if you will. So I just hope people will bear that in mind as they think about options going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, very much. Let's see, do we have any other members of the public who are with us this afternoon that would like to share a comment with the commission? Please either raise your hand on Zoom or star 9 on the phone, and we'll get you in. Otherwise, it looks like people might be chatted out for talked out for today. That's sort of what I'm seeing. But I'm sure the airways will be a buzz between now and next Monday with lots of questions and thoughts and comments, and I'm sure the commission website will be hopping with thousands and thousands of downloads of these reports and the simulator, and people are going to be giving this thing a run for its money. So anything else anybody wants to add for the good of the cause? Bruce, you have anything you want to bring in?
Just to let folks know that in the next couple of days on the commission website and as a news release, we'll be providing an update on the commission's work as of today, and then project out over the next couple of months what our plans are for continuing to both receive public input, but also for the commission to begin to work with information we've collected so far, including the AIR model and input, to begin to craft thoughts about what possible solutions or pathways there might be to achieve the charge that the legislature assigned to the commission at its formation. So a reminder that this cake is not even half baked yet, so don't start dipping into it. We have a lot more work to do before we get a more concrete sense of the direction that we're headed in. Everything's on the table right now. Nothing's been taken off the table. And so the commission continues to work with a variety of options in a very complicated, both empirically complicated and politically complicated matter. So again, watch for additional information and statements from the commission posted on our website this week and in the coming weeks.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Well, it's absolutely true. I mean, we had Indy 500 yesterday, and so I think it would be appropriate to say we're coming at turn 4 right now, and a lot of work to do in the next 3 months leading up to December. So great. Well, thanks everybody, and be well, and we will see you next week, if not before. So
thank you.
All right, take care all.
Thanks so much.